This podcast was created as a part of Podcast Lab by India Film Project in association with Anchor by Spotify.
I'm a storyteller's daughter. My mother is a storyteller, but I also realize that my entire family is a family of very animated storytellers. Right from my grandmom, my maternal grandparents as well. Everybody has always enjoyed telling stories, not just to one another, but to me and to anyone who comes. It's something as simple as my mom used to say this about her father, my tata. If you ask him what did you do today, he would never say, "Oh, I worked for a few minutes. I worked for a few hours, and then I had lunch and I took a nap." It's always, "Oh, I got up, I did this, I went there, I did that." It's just so much detail, but he would always make it engaging. And I think that's the kind of storyteller he was. With my grandmother, it was always so. My grandmother, grew up in Malaysia. So when she used to give me, when she was making lunch for me, she would always, there was a little story about how she learned that particular recipe or who she learned this from. With my paternal grandmom, she till date, I mean, it's always about stories of how she got to from place A to place B, what she did, and it's she's like, "Oh, I did this and I did that," and she loves reading a lot of literature as well. So she would try and like tell me about what's happening in that book. So it's always been like that. We all like sitting over a table and discussing stories. So storytelling has always been something I associate with family. Um, and again, creativity again. So I come from a family of musicians. So music has always been a way of life. It's revered. It's very divine, but at the same time, it's also something we have absolute fun with. So sometimes we're listening to a song on the radio, and then my grandmother will like pause and say, "Oh, when I was in Bombay and I was like so many years old, I heard this song in the radio, and then that led to this, and then so nothing has ever been consumed without a story in my household." So I think for me, storytelling has just been something I associate so deeply with family and all the emotions that come around it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Closet Writer Chronicles. I'm your host Sangeeta, aka the Moody Marshmallow. You just heard our guest for today, Dhwani Sabesh. Dhwani is a cloud kitchen brand creator for a leading food delivery platform in India. A Young India Fellow from Ashoka University, she also studied media and culture from the University of London. In 2021, she co-authored the children's book Paati's Rasam with her mother Janaki Sabesh, published by Karadi Tales. She is passionate about cooking and all things food, which she documents on Instagram from time to time. Tune in to hear about Dhwani's journey into writing, food, and her creative influences. Welcome back to the Closet Writer Chronicles. This week, I have with me Dhwani Sabesh. Welcome to the show, Dhwani. It's so good to have you here.
Hi, Sangeeta. It's great that I'm seeing you after, I guess, 8 years, but at least over Zoom. But yeah, it's been great fun. And this is a different change from college.
Yeah, for sure. For listeners who may not know, I know Dhwani from my undergrad. We were in different departments, but she was my senior in college.
Was I your senior? I always thought we were batchmates.
No, Dhwani, you're 1 year older than me.
Okay, that's okay. That's fine. For a second, I felt older than I currently am. But
no.
Building kids are calling me auntie now, so I've like officially crossed over to the dark side.
Yes, such is adulting, sadly. But this show is not for us to go into that depression of becoming older. let's not depress our listeners. But yeah, I think first off, what is your earliest memory of writing? What is like the first thing you ever like sat down and wrote, whether it was for fun or just like, oh, I want to try my hand at this. What was it for you?
Yeah, so I actually don't have a very clear memory of the first thing I wrote. I think my earliest memory of writing was my summers at Good Books and those workshops. But I do have very vivid memories of my first few music classes because
Okay.
I think for me, creativity has always primarily been associated with music.
Hmm.
It's because I come from a family of musicians. I come from a family where actually music is beyond an art form. It's actually a way of life. And
Right.
I always say this in jest, but it's very true because just to set some context, my on my dad's side, he lost his dad when he was 15. So my grandmom had three kids to bring up, and the only thing she knew was music. So she would take music classes, and that's kind of how one thing led to another, and everybody kind of got settled in the way she said that. She was like, I helped everybody settle down because of my music. So for us, music is it's not also something that's so divine that you can't touch it, which is why it's very interesting. It's very worshipped, it's very sacred, but at the same time, it's also our way of having fun. Like we're sitting together, it's not just like an antakshi, right? We're like trying to find this song and that song, and so for me, I remember my first music class, and my mother, being my mother, has also recorded it. So there's a 3-year-old me squeaking, there's like a frequency pushki box here, and I'm just like somewhere else on a different planet. But so I think for me, that's my earliest memory. And I think it was always a constant, not like a north star, but sort of like a line that just runs through your life, and you do everything in parallel. Like music's just there.
Hmm.
So music has always been there, and then through music, I also realized that everybody in my family, my immediate family, everyone has a parallel creative track. And when you were, when I was thinking about this, I realized that everybody, like there's someone who's a musician, I have somebody who writes, somebody who writes in different languages. It's always been like that at home. So a lot of creativity was just seeing everybody jam on a table and say, okay, let's do this, let's do that. My dad has this really hilarious habit where he would take any famous song, Bollywood song, or any film song that I really liked,
Mm-hmm.
and he would twist the lyrics. He would sing the lyrics in reverse and gibberish. And I remember we used to have power cuts in like Madras of like
Yeah.
1993 and 94. There were power cuts and stuff. And I remember my dad wrote a song about how it's not wrote a song, but he gave like really funny lyrics to Mukabla, and that's what we
Hey.
would sing to entertain ourselves when the fan was not working, and really funny things like that. So yeah, I think creativity has meant so many different things that it's been very difficult to point out to one specific thing, right? So yeah, it's all of these memories. Like you just can't. My granddad, for instance, he was obsessed with the newspaper, and his biggest thing for me was I had to read the newspaper every day. He would
Okay.
conduct a quiz for me every Sunday to see how well I read the week's paper.
Oh
I
wow.
was
Okay.
6. I was 6. Just making that very clear.
Okay then.
So, and I used to go and ask him, Tata, what is this? Tata, what is that? And he launched into these. And he used to work in the publishing industry, so he had an
Okay.
impeccable vocabulary, and he had this big booming baritone, and did not slightly hard of hearing in one ear, so he didn't realize how loud he was. With his booming voice, he'd explain. So much before we started learning, political science in school,
Yeah.
I was just very well equipped, and I was fully prepared to show off that yes, my Tata has taught me all of this. So yeah, with all of this, it's just been like this massive avial. I can't even think of any other word. I don't even like avial. It is like one big avial. There's just everything there, and that's what it's always
But
been.
then, what is then okay, like you started music, and we'll get into the avial part of it because food is a big part of this conversation coming up. But, what is then, when did you even attempt to just, write a word? Was it then just English classes? Was it, when was
Yeah,
it?
I think there was a point where so my mom's always been this. She's always been the kind of person who'd get herself involved in multiple activities.
Okay.
And they had a few immediate goals for me, which was they realized that I love to talk. There are
Okay.
multiple instances of people who've met me as a 2-year-old saying, if I would find a mic or I would pretend that anything was a mic and just like talk into it, even if it was absolute gibberish. So I think that's when my parents recognized, that there were some things that I could be put into. So music, of course, was a given. There was dance class because I remember someone coming and saying that if I choose to sing tomorrow on stage, I shouldn't be at least have like a pleasant face to look at.
Okay.
Just holding a posture and being sort of, for want of a better phrase, I'd say prim and proper. and
Okay.
not being an eyesore to the audience.
Okay.
That was the reasoning I was given for Bharatanatyam classes. So there was
Okay.
music, there was Bharatanatyam, and yeah, I just loved doing these things. I would enact stuff at home, and so I was put into theater. So there was I was with the Little Theater for
Okay.
about 3 years before exams became a feature of my life. So that was there, and it was all about like getting over stage fright. And somewhere along this, I think the writing happened. And I realized actually a catalyst for the writing was my mom's colleague at work, Sudha Aunty, who
Okay.
I till date refer to her as the tooth fairy,
Okay.
because she wrote my note when my first tooth fell off, and I recognized her handwriting. Because
Oh.
my mom said this one's clever, she's going to find this out, but no, I still like found out that it was Sudha Aunty's. But anyway, so I remember she telling my mother, my mom used to work with an ad, like with a production house at that time. And I used to go with her sometimes to her office space and apparently serve everybody pretend tea, because that's the first thing people say to me. So she would keep me in this room and she would just say, Janaki, throw books around her. She'll get bored and she will pick up a book. So I had these books called Tatty Ted. I don't know
Okay.
if you've ever read it. They were these board books about this teddy bear called Tatty.
Okay.
And Tatty Ted would go fishing, and they had a lovely little red briefcase of its own.
Okay.
So I remember discovering books through that. And then I went through a very, very long phase where it would be impossible to peel me away from a book.
Okay.
And I think somewhere around that is when I started like creating stories of my own.
Mm-hmm.
And Good Books was just there at like perfect timing, right? I was right place at the right time. Good Books was there. There were these workshops for children. And I think I had a very nice English teacher in school. Her name was Vasudha Miss, who also told my mother that this one writes, you should like try and find her, give her opportunities to write. So everything just aligned at the right time. But my earliest memories of writing are in Good Books, which was this lovely bookstore in Chennai that had workshops for children.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had signed me up for a writing workshop with this amazing woman, the journalist called Sandhya Rao.
Mm-hmm.
So Sandhya Aunty, she taught us how to use our words and write stories, and her focus on grammar. And whatever I write today, full credit to Sandhya Aunty. I think she's just been that person who's helped me write. So just workshops after workshops. I think I wonder if it was also a way for my parents to keep me occupied when they had other things to do. But even if it was, very grateful to them, because my parents. I think it just comes back to my family being so creative, right? That it's just a given that, okay, you need to be occupied with doing creative stuff. Like I was forced to go for sports coaching once in my life and I hated it because I'm not a sports person. And I would just trade that off any day. Like badminton coaching, I'd be sitting in the corner reading a book. So it was like that. Stuff like that. So I think that's just where everything came together.
That's really interesting, because I think even for me, like my first memory of writing is actually just English classes in school. It's actually English exams. I used to enjoy writing my English exams in school, like especially the
How
essay.
old were you when you had your first exam?
I must have been we used to have those tests like when I was in first, second standard, but I think proper exams must have been like, I guess, like 6th standard onwards or something. I think like 5th, 6th standard onwards. And I very distinctly remember, like, especially in high school, like for me, English exams used to be very therapeutic, especially those English 2 papers, because I know that'd be essay writing and I'd leave it for the last. Because for me, I don't know, I used to be very relaxed doing it. I would take my time writing because I was having fun also doing it. And it didn't feel like an exam for me. But obviously you don't think that, oh, this could potentially become a career at some point in your life. But yeah. So no, it's just fun to hear, people's stories of how they first even get into something creative or, with words, so to speak. But having said that, you spoke about books. Which are like some writers or stories then that have really impacted you? Because I feel like everyone who is creative or who isn't, or who doesn't even claim to be creative, does have like certain stories that do impact them or stay with them to some degree. So what are those for you?
So I'm going to go sort of backwards from recent to back in time. So some books in the recent like past 5 years that have really, really left a very big mark on me. One was Purple Hibiscus by Adichie.
Yeah.
There was just something so beautiful about the way she explored the concept of just grayness where you can have somebody who's so loving but who's also so terrible, and not in a sort of. I see that we tend to go into polarities. We try and go very black and white, right? So someone's so abusive, someone's so this, but this from the eyes of a child, and someone who's just growing up. I found that very, very beautiful. The illicit happiness of other people. The character of Thoma is just such a, like, I'm having goosebumps whenever I talk about that character. So beautiful, and the fact that it was, I have, my heart is always in Madras. So whenever I find like mentions of Madras in any book, I just become like extra happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that book being said, one book that really moved me, and I think I've not had it in me to come back for a second read, is one of the books that really shaped the way I think about a lot of things, is M and the Big Room by Jerry Pinto. It's a stunning book, and I don't think anybody has spoken about mental health with the kind of fragility and clarity at the same time the way he has. It's such a beautiful book. I think these were the 3 books in the past few years that I've always like held on to. I was also reading a bunch of other things. I mean, obviously Harry Potter has always been that one defining moment in my life where I would like get the book the day, stand in queue at Landmark, get your book, come back, read it, not take anything away, and then read it again for the next 3 days. There was that. Roald Dahl. I love Roald Dahl. I think for me, Witches and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I think, Witches is always my top book. And not just because it has a scene in the restaurant, but I think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, of course, Witches. And then there were a lot of books, in between that I've just sort of constantly kept picking up and reading and figuring something out from it over and over again. I used to sneak up and read Sidney Sheldon because I wasn't allowed to. It was not PG-13, right?
Yeah.
So I used to read Sidney Sheldon, and then my dad used to give me a list of books that he read when he was in college. And then, stuff like that. I'm actually now struggling to think of other books.
But I love the list of books you gave. I've not read some of them, so I'm really looking forward to checking those out for sure. Especially the one by Jerry Pinto, which you mentioned.
It's a stunning book.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was that all your experiences have contributed to this big abyss of creativity, which comes to food then, because I know, and I know I've seen you post recipes, I've seen you like post, personal stories attached to food and, making dishes and, your experiments with them. And of course, you have like a public Instagram page where you predominantly post about food, but I've seen you post mostly about that. How did your interest in, food begin? And, when did you start, sort of cooking, getting into it, and then, saying, hey, maybe I could, just post about my experiences with it? Like, how did that happen?
So, like I said, family again. We are the kind of family that will be on the dining table eating one meal and planning our next couple of meals. It's always been that way. And my uncle, that's my dad's brother, and my mom's sister are excellent cooks. But my biggest influence has been my grandmother. I grew up with her right across the road, and obnoxious as it sounds, I used to decide which house I would go to after school, whether it was my parents' house or my grandparents' house, based on the menu of the day.
Wow.
So invariably, my Paati always won. Like there was, and my Paati had a very interesting story because we're somewhat Palakkad, we're somewhat Tamil, but my Paati grew up in Malaysia. So she would always tell me stories. So she would make these very interesting dishes for me. And, everything was always accompanied by a story saying, so there was something she used to make called tauke. And it's a sprouts curry. And she used to say, she used to always serve that to me and tell me the story of how her mother learned it from some neighbor in Malaysia, and then they made it, and, things like that. And my grandfather used to always say, so my Paati's name was Sarasa. So you say anybody can cook, but only Sarasa can cook with love. And he used to always say that. And, she used to always do these little things for me. So it became very central. Like I used to always joke, I could have eaten a buffet somewhere and I'll enter my Paati's house and I'll be hungry again. So I think Paati was the biggest influence in terms of what food could mean, right? Because she loved food, and the other thing she loved was books. So she was either cooking or reading. So it was always it was a very nice, and she loved discussing books with me. And she would, in fact, like sneak me money and say, can you get this? So from my school library, I used to get her Sidney Sheldon's back for her and get another book for myself. and we used to do things like that. So it was very nice. So somewhere I think I maybe subconsciously, because I don't actively remember spending too much time with my Paati cooking. I remember most of my time eating and like hearing her stories. And she passed when I just about started college, which I honestly wish she had stayed on for longer, because I think when you're switching from school to college is when you're that angsty teenager who doesn't want anything to do with anybody. And I definitely wish she'd been around for more, because I think she would have enjoyed a lot more of what's happening in with just food in general and just the way I cook now. So it started there, and my earliest memory of cooking. So my dad's an excellent cook as well. Mom also cooks. My uncle's a cook. Was and I have a photo of this as well. This is my dad teaching me how to cut a potato.
Okay, wow, okay.
How to hold the knife and how to cut it and all of that. And once I remember, saying I'm going to make, there was some vegetable I didn't like. I think it was avial for all I know. And I wanted to make myself a potato curry. And I didn't want anybody else to know. And silly child, I must have been 10 or younger at that point. I cut a potato and like raw potatoes, raw turmeric, raw everything. And I mixed it thinking I can eat. And obviously it tasted like crap. And that's when I realized I need to learn how to cook. A lot of it came from observation, but I think the biggest switch for me was actually Masterchef. There was something, and I remember the first season to come on TV in India was Masterchef season 2, the one with Marion and everybody. And I remember watching that, and it really opened up my brain in a way where I was like, oh my God, you can do so much with food. Like you watch Sanjeev Kapur, like every Sunday I used to sit and watch Sanjeev Kapur, Rakesh, Sethi, like these host of Indian chefs, and Tarla, Dalal, and I had these Tarla, Dalal books at home which I would always want to watch, and I'll sit on the countertop when my mom made a pulao. I've done all of that, but there was something so pivotal about Masterchef, because it actually gave me a very different perspective on food. Because till then you're very used to your idea of Western food, like, because it's Indian and Western, like how we divide music, which is so weird when we say Indian music and Western music. Anything that's not Indian is just Western, right? And sort of was always limited to a pasta that my mom would make or somebody else would make, and then you learn these things. And then the internet also kind of opened up at the right time, I think, for us. And I discovered Nigella, and she was one of the first people I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. She's somebody who's just making incredible food. And one thing led to another, cookbooks. And I actually don't remember when, like there was, I'm fairly certain there was a switch that was flipped, where you went from just like being in the background to being like center stage with food. But yeah, it just happened. And my mom always tells me that, my dad always makes fun of my memory. He says, you remember too many things. You remember things I wish you wouldn't remember also. But my mom once noticed that all my memories are related with food. Like I remember something that happened at that particular moment because of what we were eating, which is really funny when you think about it. So all of that, I think, just sort of came together very well. Was in college, I think you had more time to do things, and it just happened. It sounds a bit cliche, but it just happened. I don't remember. I remember things of like used to get these pre-mixed packets of, fried rice and Manchurian. I think it was Nor. So I remember doing like Mother's Day dinners and Father's Day dinners with basic stuff like this, and always complaining how it never tasted the way I wanted it to taste. And then it sort of just built. And I did the Young India Fellowship right out of college. And that's one program which sort of really, it's focused a lot about making you look inward. So I became better friends with myself and realizing what I liked and what I didn't like. Where I realized that food has always been, the central passion. Like there was mess khana down at the, the hostel, but I would steal like a boiled egg. I would have like couscous in my room, and everybody from YF remembers it. So I used to cook couscous and boiled egg and whatever like quick things I could do without a flame, because I didn't want to eat the mess food. And now when I think back, it's stupid. Like, why would you do that? But that's also, I think, just where my brain is always working. Like even now, like this morning, I was grocery shopping and you're staring at things and you're like, okay, brain is working and just connecting multiple dots. So I do think that happened because I connected with myself a lot more and just realized how intrinsic it is to my being. I've just lucked out in the sense that my career has also taken me in a sense, to the place where I am working with food day in and day out. So I think everything just fell into place very nicely. And then my best friend actually gifted me a cookbook for my birthday. And then I started, that one cookbook has now become 40 cookbooks. I just collect cookbooks, collect recipes, sit with people, find out. It's become my way of connecting with people, but most importantly, myself. So I think that's, in short, not a very short answer of how food came into my life.
No, but that's really interesting to hear. And, just listening to, your journey with it and how food's become such a big part of it. And, I was just thinking, and there was a lot I resonated with just in terms of, because my maternal grandmother was an excellent cook, and it's right, you associate memories with food. Sometimes, like a lot of my memories of her is around food and is around books as well. In fact, she's the one who got me into reading. So, I attribute a lot of my love for words and stories to her. So, I could really resonate when you were talking about, your grandmother and food and books. And I was like, oh my God, I completely get it. Or I don't know if it's a grandmother thing also, but
it is possible. Maybe it's a grandmother thing. And so I've been reading Masala Lab, right, by Krish Ashok. And he talks about how a lot of our sense of taste, and we say, oh, this doesn't taste like that. He says, we don't understand what a huge role memory plays when we're tasting something. So it's at that moment your experience. So, like, for example, something that I make from my grandmom's book, now I'm a little more convinced that it tastes like hers. So I'm going to narrate a little funny. It's an anecdote from my childhood, right? So she used to make this korambu. It's a Tairi-based korambu called it's called Molaga korambu in my house. So it's just like lots of curd and pepper, and it's always something that we've all grown up having when we had bad stomachs.
Okay.
And so once I had a bad stomach, my grandparents used to live in Delhi before they moved to Chennai. And my mom called my grandmom and said, listen, Dhwani wants to eat this. Can you please give me the recipe? So she noted down the recipe. And I think mom and dad set out to make this for me. Now, because I was already with an upset stomach and I was like a child, I was given Metrogyl, the syrup, which is a disgusting yellow, horrendous syrup, as most syrups are. And it was this really watery thing. And I think my parents didn't get the ratio right. So they made a very watery model korambu for me. And I remember taking a look at it. And the first thing I did was place an STD call, which, at that time, making an STD call is a big deal, to Delhi, and crying to my grandmother saying, my parents don't know how to cook like you. They've made me Metrogyl.
Oh my God.
So till date, that korambu is referred to as Metrogyl in my house. And this is the kind of stuff, right? Like it's like my parents always say that, I am this really finicky person. I'm a picky eater, not because I don't eat things, but because I expect a sense of perfection in everything. So, which is why grandmothers spoil us.
True. Let's talk about Paati's Rasam, because I know one of the inspirations, or possibly the main inspiration behind that, is your grandmother and her cooking. How did that book come about? For listeners who don't know, Paati's Rasam is this children's book that Dhwani has co-authored with her mother, Janaki Sabesh. And I will let you talk about it more, what the book is, how the idea came about, and, talk to us about the process of writing it and just being published. And now that it's out, how do you feel?
So my mom's a storyteller, and more than being a storyteller, my mother is, she's like an idea machine. And I mean this in the nicest way possible, because, we could just be sitting and suddenly you see her eyes just like widen, and it's like she's got an idea. And she's just full of ideas, no matter what we're doing. She's so creative, right? So one such trip, I think she was in Nagaland. She'd gone for a children's literature festival, and I get a call, and this is a very rickety bus that's taking her from Kohima to, I want to say Imphal, but I'm not sure. Kohima, I think we were driving down somewhere to the nearest airport. I'm not sure where it was. But yeah, she was driving around Kohima on a rickety bus, and I get a call with Patchy Network and says, Dhwani, I've got an idea. I said, yes, ma, what's the idea? And she says, I want to write a story about this little girl who loves eating her Paati's Rasam, and then her Paati dies, and the Rasam recipe is gone as well. And what does she do after? And for me, and I'm having goosebumps while saying it, because my most favorite thing that Paati used to always make for me is Rasam. And so she passed in 2011, and for some reason, I've never been able to like Rasam as much as like I used to then. Rasam became one of my lesser favorite foods. And I realize now that where it probably came from, because it was never like parties.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, okay, Mom's first book had just come out. And this was sort of like, she was going for these fests with her first book, which was about the Jungle Storytelling Festival. And the other person who was there with her on this trip was Shobha Vishwanath of Karadi Tales. So after telling me the idea, she told Shobha Aunty the idea, and Shobha Aunty said, just write it. That was, I think, in 2017 or 18, and we're in 2022. The book came out in 2021. It took us a long time to actually come to the book, write the book, because we struggled. So we had the idea, but we didn't have a story. And you realize that this is a great idea, but how do you translate that idea into a story? And we've written, I think, 25 drafts. When you think about it, right, it's 300 words. Effectively, you need to write, and that's when you realize how brevity is such a undervalued skill, like being able to communicate with brevity. Because how do you, what are the themes you want to convey in this? What is it that you want? And is it a personal story? What do you want to do with it? Like, there are so many questions. And I think we struggled the most with figuring out logic, because we were so close to the story ourselves, right? We kept writing versions which were very similar to what had happened with my grandmom, where she'd actually fallen sick a couple of months before she passed. And then we realized that for us, that's a very important story. But for a child sitting and reading this outside, does that really hold value?
Right.
And you also need to kind of signal to the parent, because there's a parent who's going to be reading this to a child at some point.
Yeah.
And then, okay, you've got that part. Then how do you make it end? Like, one of our earliest endings was that she makes the rasam and then she realizes that the magic ingredient was love. And then we looked at each other and we said, do we really want to do something this vanilla? Like, it's cliched. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't inspire. So Shobha Aunty was a great help. I mean, she's somebody who we went to her with multiple drafts and she was like, no, this is not working and this is why it's not working. So going through that entire process to finally come to this book, which is Paati's Rasam, which is about this little girl who loves her Paati's Rasam, and then her Paati dies and the recipe goes away, and what she does. When we were closer to hitting the note with the right draft, something that happened was a very close friend of ours lost her father. And her daughter, just went through a series of emotions because she had lost a grandparent. And she just didn't know what she could do. And we realized, and of course, this child is much older than Malli, who is the protagonist of our book. She was about 10 or 11. We realized that we don't talk to adults, forget children. We don't talk about grief the way we ought to, right? Because even I don't think I've spoken about the grief of losing my grandmother as well, as much as I should have, or even felt it in very weird ways. Like, you realize how you feel it in with the passage of time. But at that moment, I don't remember crying as much when my grandma passed away. But it's hit me later in waves. You miss her at that moment. And just talking about how grief is sort of, I think someone recently posted, grief is all the love that you cannot give.
Yeah.
And or about how you grow around your grief. And I think talking to children about it, especially, because when we were revising this is also when the pandemic hit. And then you realize that there is a sudden sense, like, it's a bit of grief in overdrive, because it's not just the grief of family, but so many people. And just yes, we may not have known everybody who we've lost to the pandemic, but there is a certain sense of grief that I think all of us hold about just something so terrible and something so, and then now there's a war and there's so many things, and we realize that you need to talk about grief. So that's when we actually got a lot more direction about how do you say things about grief without saying much, and realizing that there are bits and pieces of people you can hold on to. And to quote Harry Potter, I think the people who you love never really leave you, and how you choose to hold on to them. So so that's actually how the book finally materialized. So it's nice. And in this case, the idea that my mom had was very central about food. I mean, this could have been Paati's notebook for all you wanted, and there would have been a different way of, maybe the notebook was missing and you find the notebook. But
Hmm.
the idea, it just came naturally to us because we were still, definitely carrying forward a lot of what we felt with my grandmom at that point. So that's how the book came.
But that's amazing, and the fact that it's finally out. I'm yet to read it. I have placed my order, so I'm hoping that it comes soon and I'm able
Yay!
to read
I
it.
hope you like it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it because I feel like children's books in general today are so much deeper than, I feel like people are just like, oh, but it's a kid's book, who cares? But I feel like there's a lot more depth today, especially in, I think, children's publishing and, just the books coming out. But even if you
Yeah.
look at books from before, like one book I read last year was The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupery, which is like a very old children's book, but is so relevant today. And
Yes.
it's like he talks about the human condition through like a fantasy story, which is for kids, but honestly, adults can read it too. So really looking forward
Absolutely.
to reading your book as well.
Yeah.
But, having said that, what was it like working with your mother? Because uh, because I feel like, see, a working relationship with your parent can be a very tricky place to be because I'm sure like people have a lot of fun working with their parents, but sometimes like, is it easy to separate personal from professional with a parent? Like, do you just have fights sometimes and be like, oh my God, you're just not getting what I'm saying? Or do you just agree to disagree? Was it like challenging or was it just really smooth on the whole to work with her?
So I feel like to answer this question, I need to like take a minute to set
Yeah.
context about my relationship with my mother.
Yeah,
Because
for sure.
obviously growing up, my parents were very strict parents and, all of that is there. But I think like a switch flipped again when we were 16 and then my mom's my best friend. It's always been that way. We just like we fight, but she's like my best friend. Like I can't go a day without talking to her. Like every morning, even if I'm talking to her for 5 minutes, that needs to happen. So because we have this really friendly relationship, it obviously leads to you're not listening to me. Can you listen to me? At some level, you forget that who's the parent and who's the child. If you ask my mother, I'm very sure she'll be like, "Don't ever work with Dhwani unless you know what you want," because my biggest problem is that I have patience for everybody in the world except for myself and my mother. So I am deeply impatient. I also tend to set very high standards for myself for no reason at all. And the third is I'm just impatient. Like I just want things done then and there. And if it's not happening, like my impatience leads to that frustration and that high standards, and it just goes in this big loop. Uh, Thankfully, we had a calming force in Shobanti because we knew that okay, at a certain time, at a certain time you need to send a draft to her, which is the manuscript. So there was a clear deliverable. Thank God we had that. It was also helpful because I knew that in this case the idea was my mother's, and I was translating the idea into a story.
Right.
And obviously we were doing it together. I think had we had the story clear in our heads, it might have been an easier process. But because of the distinction of you have the idea, let's see how you can translate, and that was a distinction that just sort of naturally came into place. It was still easier than I guess it would have been. Plenty of arguments. It's ended with me just getting off the table and saying, you know what, I don't want to see your face for the next half an hour. But hey, you're in the middle of a pandemic. The three of you are in the same house. So like stay in one corner of the room, you're in the other corner of the room, meet again in half an hour.
Yeah.
So, or just like go to the terrace when nobody else is there, take a walk because you want fresh air. So all of that happened. But yeah, will I do it again? Yes, I definitely will do it again with mom. We've realized what we need, the amount of clarity that you need to write, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately this is 300 words. So we've written drafts that were as much as 2,500 words long just to get the story right. Okay. And then use it and shave and shave and shave and shave and shave. And what we also don't realize, and what my mother realizes a little more because she's already written one picture book for children, is a lot that you say in children's books, I think need to be said without saying it. Leave some, basically needs to be a little more implicit. There is, like, for example, one of my drafts spent about, I would say, 100 words just describing the kitchen and how she would go on the kitchen countertop and look at this. And then you realize your illustrator and your storyboarder will just make that happen. So that shaves off 100 words of one shot. right? That's
Okay.
more of like descriptive direction. Um, and also, just going back to what you were saying, like children's literature today is a lot more. You find that the books are a lot deeper today.
Yeah.
That's also because children, I find like children today are way smarter. Maybe like the previous generation felt that about us when we were growing up.
True.
But like one of my friends, 7-year-olds, like I spoke to her the other day and she was telling me, I said, so how are you doing today? She said, I'm doing very terribly. I didn't know this. I didn't know how to speak like this when I was 6. And then I said, what happened? And she said, no, it's just, I had a sty the other day. Now I have a cold. What an exhausting life to have. And then she just walks off from the video call frame. And I was like, oh, wow. And the other thing that she said to me, I wanted to, like, she was like making watermelon juice one day. I'm like, can I have? And she's like, no, it'll be 10 pence. She's reading Enid Blyton. So I said, I don't have 10 pence. Okay, you can buy this on credit. I'm learning what credit is now. Like,
Wow.
stop. And they ask very deep questions and they know a lot more. And
True.
I think we've also, this particular generation of kids, I find them being very great at communicating. Like, for instance, and I think we've also, I think their parents have made an emphasis on like, use your words. I see my cousins saying this a lot to their children. When they're just like throwing a tantrum, they're like, I don't know what's going on. Use your words. Tell me what's happening. So the fact that you're giving them the agency to speak, also means that the way they consume your book is going to be different because they're going to ask questions. They're going to, so I remember one draft when we wrote this and there was a massive logical flaw that we hadn't seen it. We're like, no, who's this kid? And they're like, no, the child will point this saying, but why? Like children today, I think are negotiating more. They're asking questions. So in that situation, right, I think you need to assume that you are writing for a very, very intelligent reader. And a reader who is going to ask questions that you couldn't have even thought of.
Right.
So just how much you leave unsaid is also very important. And this was something Shobhanti had taught us. She said, kids are they're very perceptive. Let them ask questions. You want this to start a conversation.
Right.
You want this to talk about, but why? Like, why didn't she do this? Why didn't she do that? Why is she sad? And things like that. So yeah, I think that's been a huge learning curve with this book.
Oh, that's really interesting to hear, and I think children's publishing is in a very interesting space today. So it's really intriguing to see the subjects people are coming out with and talking about.
Absolutely.
And writing about it. It's because there's this one publisher I came across which is by an Indian lady who's based in the UK. It's called Groggy Eyes, and where she talks about like different issues for children. Her name's Sangeeta Mule. So she talks about, again, losing a grandparent, grief, and she touches upon like body positivity for children. Like, it's just incredible to see these topics come out for kids today. And you really, sometimes think, man, I wish I could have read about these things when I was growing up. It would have made such a big difference. So
I fully agree. I think empathy, driving that home to children, like now at this particular, like when they're younger, is so much nicer because I grew up with, I grew up being bullied for a lot of things. And I know a lot of people did. And I think a lot of it just comes from maybe, if you understand the other person better, you're probably not going to be as mean or say things, that are as nasty. So, yeah. And, and another thing for me, which was very, very fulfilling with this book was the fact that it was Karadi tales because, one of the earliest books that I've picked up have always been Karadi tales. I used to, the Blue Jackal was my favorite. I can still sing, the songs in my sleep. With like the tapping of the bamboo cane and you turn the page, and it felt like this big activity. You play that and you can do this completely. I don't need help to read. And the fact that it's come back to Karadi tales is just so wonderful. Yeah, it was very nice little
full circle.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful when that happens, right? And I think that's the beauty of life. You just have no idea when things come full circle with some things, like, so.
Absolutely.
Which is just amazing. And it's really beautiful to hear that also. But yeah, I think, talking about these topics for kids and all, and also I think shifting gears a bit because, talking about this, I know you've openly spoken about vitiligo, which is a condition I know you're going through, as you have.
Yes.
And you've openly spoken about it. And I personally do have a lot of respect for the fact that, you were able to talk about it with so much of, honesty, vulnerability, and also just a lot of dignity and grace, honestly speaking. You did. And I remember I even messaged you when you did post about it. I don't know if you have any memory of this, but
I do. Thank you.
But yeah, I remember reaching out to you and saying that, like, more power to you for even talking about this and sharing this, because these conversations just aren't there, and it's important to have people come out and talk about it. But for the benefit of listeners, could you tell us what vitiligo is, first of all, what your experience has been like with the condition, just accepting it, going with it, and, also just openly talking about it, what that's been like for you?
Thank you. I've been told that it takes a certain amount of bravery, but I think maybe it does, but it's also, I think, I would hope that there is one day where talking about it isn't considered brave, which is
exactly. Yeah.
So I was diagnosed when I was in 11th, though I think I was seeing some patches and trying to hide them from when I was in class 9. So we're talking about almost like from the point of diagnosis, almost 15 years. But in effect, vitiligo is a condition where your skin color producing cells, which is your melanocytes that produce the melanin, they are suppressed. So they effectively end up not producing the melanin. So you end up having white patches on your skin. So that is in short what vitiligo is. And I think for me, the first few years were really not as difficult because they were always in places that were very well hidden. Nobody could see it because it was on my back or on my chest or on my stomach. And I'm like, who's going to see this? It doesn't make a difference. And then there was a time where it started coming on my hands, like on my fingers. That's when there was a little bit of flux, I'd say, in my head, because like, what does this mean for me? See, I think for me personally, a lot of my bullying that happened in school was just on the basis of how I looked, because I was a certain size, I was a bit chubby, etc., etc. So even if nobody explicitly said something, you're always in that thing of, oh my God, somebody's going to say something about this.
Yeah.
So nobody has ever given me shit for my skin in that sense. Like I've never been bullied for my skin, but it's something you intern. It's not self-censorship, but I'm just giving self-censorship as an analogy, because you tend to like say, oh, someone's looking at you this way, etc., etc. You realize that so much of your perception of yourself and your perception of your self-worth, you place in the hands of other people. So I think reclaiming that was a huge, I won't say task, because I don't think I actively worked towards it. It just happened one day. But I think I went through a bunch of treatments. Then I realized I didn't have a particularly good experience with one particular treatment, because they use a lot of phototherapy and UV light. And there was one particular treatment sitting that went wrong. And I ended up having some clinical burns on my patches. And I was just like, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm happy with the way I am. I will deal with this later. So that was there. And around that time was, so I kind of like left the treatment part of it behind. What actually really made me talk about this was, again, children are amazing. So I have my nephew, his name is Abhay, but this little kid in my life, Abhay, he's incredibly special to me. So, and he loves books. So I remember sitting and reading to him, and I noticed that this guy is always looking at my hands. So I remember asking him, like, hey, Abhay, like, what's happening? And I was like preparing myself, okay, he's going to say something. And he's like, what's that on your skin? So, and Abhay was what, 5 or 6 at this point. So I was like thinking of, how do you explain this to a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old? And I said, my immune system is basically eating up, my skin producing cells. And he said, why? I said, it's like they think that they're the bad guys. And his first answer was like, does it hurt when they eat? Because it's something eating something, right? So I was already melting at that point. I was like, oh no, Abhay, it doesn't hurt. And then he said, he just looked at me, and then I remember his words, and he said, I think it's really cool. You get to have 2 skin colors at once.
Yeah.
And that moment for me was just, damn, I've never seen it that way. You always see it as a fault and not as something positive to have. And I this was what, 5-6 years ago, and for me it was an instant switch that just like flipped. And it seems a bit weird to say it this way, but it actually happened. From that moment, the way I looked at it just changed, because it becomes more of an asset than a liability, I guess, in many ways, even though it had never been something that was weighing me down too much. So I think after that, I realized just how much it made such a positive impact. And I think I wanted to tell that story of how, children, it's so lovely because they're at a stage where, things don't bother them. And maybe you realize that maybe at age 6, nobody teaches you to bully someone. Like, these are learned behaviors.
Yeah.
And it's a learned behavior because there is a certain way where it's an invisible rule, literally, that you have to look and behave a certain way, because how else will children as young as 7 and 8 actually even start saying things to each other, right?
Yeah.
So around that time is when Dushyant of Kriya Shakti was working on a series of monologues for this for the play called Dolls, and we were just talking about this, and I was telling him the story, and he said, no, they should go on stage. And theatre has been something I've done on and off. So Dushi said, why don't you write a monologue? So I wrote my monologue. It was very cathartic for me. I think that's when I realized, in that journey of telling the story, you have to focus on the downs as well. And you realize that while no one's ever come and said something to you, you could be in a meeting and you notice someone staring at your hands. You don't blame them, because I probably would have done the same thing, but sort of making it okay. It's okay for you to come and ask. And I remember a bunch of advocates for disability rights, right? I follow them on Instagram, and they said things like, if someone's asking, because I remember they were narrating another story about a child seeing somebody, a double amputee on a wheelchair and saying, why doesn't he have legs? It's just curiosity. They're not being mean.
Yeah.
And I think by saying, shh, don't talk about it, you're actually making it more of a taboo. But you can come and ask me, because it's very natural. So sort of just letting people know that it's okay to ask, as long as you're not being, ew, what is that? What is that is always better than, ew, what is that, right? So so that's when the monologue came across and came about, and wrote it, and it worked very well for me, because for me personally, it was catharsis. And I noticed a lot of people, coming in, talking to me about it and saying it helped me, or, saying, I'm glad because I'm glad you're saying this. And I remember a couple of people coming in saying how, it gave them somewhat of courage. And it was nice for me, the fact that me sharing my story could have an impact. So that was about it. And once the play came about, I realized that not everybody has access to it. And that was around the time where, my public Instagram is, as you know, I'm not very consistent in posting there. So I decided I might just talk about it as well. Because I remember someone had said something very, not very nice, I think. Something about how I claim to be exotic by having something. I don't even remember this, but there was some trigger. Somebody had said something like that. And I just, again, extreme anger, wrote something. And then it just came about. And that really helped. I had a couple of people reach out to me. There were little children who came and spoke to me and said, because it's actually a lot more common than we think. There's actually a very interesting article. I forget the platform that the article is on, but I'll never forget the headline. It's called The Dapple Dilemma Facing Vitiligo Science, which is basically that, right now you have somebody like Winnie Harlow, who's just owning her patches. And it's a lot about body positivity, because, hey, yes, you can be who you want to be. You can look any way you want. They should not stop you. But at the same time, for science to sort of move ahead, right? They want to, for want of a better word, treat it. Now, the same when you treat something as a condition, you're kind of acknowledging that there's a problem that requires to be treated.
Right.
But today you're very conscious of not addressing it as a problem. So how do you do, what do you do? Even recently, I think as recent as a week ago, someone told us about a doctor who's in Pune who people just meet him and then it stops the spread. And I'm going through that right now, saying, do I want to just meet this doctor to see what they have to say? Or does it go against the whole thing of, no, I'm body positive. I am very positive about how it is. So I think there's this, the more we have these conversations, the more we're able to, because this is a conundrum at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
It's okay to have that. It's perfectly okay if you want to go meet the doctor. But I feel like today we're in, because of cancel culture, right? You have to, it's like you have to occupy two ends of a spectrum. You cannot be in the middle. And this is something which is so in the middle. So what do you do? So I would like to talk a lot more about it. But the other thing that I've realized is beyond saying this, because it's not like I've not been treated differently because of any such thing. So I don't have too many experiences like that to share, but I have people, like a couple of people who reached out, have said things like, "Oh, I was denied so and so opportunity because of this, etc., etc." And I don't feel equipped or empowered enough to tell their stories because it's their story. But at the same time, like, what do you do? So when it comes to having these conversations, I think I've always struggled to figure out, okay, I've put this out there, but what next?
Yeah, no, because it's, and you very rightly said, this needs to be a very normal conversation as opposed to saying like, oh, this is like brave to talk about. But the sad thing is, because the conditioning is such that everyone's like, oh, it's a problem, oh, it's a condition, we shouldn't be talking about it. Which is why it is considered brave, unfortunately, today. But hopefully, with, like, say, you and even other people coming out and talking about these things, it is normalizing the conversation, hopefully making it much more, I guess, inclusive and just acceptable that, yeah, it is what it is. It's not a big deal. It's not, something to be so like, intrigued by or, shocked by or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think there's also been a similar movement, I'd say, or maybe not movement, but there's been an uptick in the way people talk about that curly hair in the past few years. I don't know if you've noticed.
True.
I've always had this curly hair. Okay, I've never known how to maintain it. It's always been the same. My mom has the same hair. She didn't know how to maintain it. We've always had these struggles of like combing through this thick hair and putting it up in a ponytail because that looks neat. And then you see people embracing it, and there's like a movement, and now you have so many brands that are dedicated to having curly hair. You have like a mainstream Bollywood actress who's now the brand ambassador of a brand, and she's like, embrace your curls, love your curls, etc. And I feel like there is going to be a time that way where we will also talk about our skin that, in a similar fashion. I think it's already begun, to be honest. I remember there are people talking about like, but these moles on people's faces that, we don't consider normal, but it's just a mole. Or Winnie, Harlow. And there's so many people I can think of right now. Like there's a young girl in Delhi who has an Instagram account called Riya Agarwal. I've been seeing her posts as well. People are just talking a lot more. So it's great to have those conversations, because I think at one point you'll just realize the more you see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think who's the actress? Gina Davis. Gina Davis has an institute, at least she had an institute, I don't know if it still exists, which would just talk about gender and representation of women in media. And they had a newsletter called See Jane, and I remember the tagline of it saying, if she can see it, she can be it. I mean, of course, that was more for young girls. So I think that's true of children overall, right? Just the more you see something, it's going to be normal. It's accepted.
Yeah. And also, like how you said, it's even, I think, because cancel culture and that whole two ends of the spectrum, it's again, it comes down to freedom of choice, right? You can be what you want to be, you can do what you want. It's your body, your choice, like what you want to do with it.
Absolutely. And I still think that if someone chooses it, I think I have had the privilege, or I've been fortunate enough to be in environments where I have never been denied anything or treated differently just because of the way my skin looks.
Yeah.
But I'm very sure that there are people who are going through a lot more, because of this, and if they choose to get some sort of like help or treatment for this, that's absolutely fine. In my case, however, I remember someone telling me that, and this was a doctor in the UK when I was studying there, just gone for another opinion, and she said, here's the thing, there is no permanent cure for this. We've still not been able to identify what it is that actually suppresses your melanocytes. So whatever we do right now is a temporary solution. Like you will regain color in that patch, but it is very likely that color will not stay forever. For me, which was when I realized that, do I really want to go through, because it's time, it's money, and in my case, it was also a bit of physical discomfort after a point of time. So do I really want to put myself through that? So I had the ability to make that choice, and I had this support from home, sort of like to say, okay, that's your choice, we respect it. I don't think, I mean, there are obviously people who may not have that support, who may not even have that knowledge, right? And I think, and I remember this doctor in the UK telling me that, people are fair there. So even when they lose color, it doesn't really show as starkly as it does on Indian skin, which is a lot more brown.
Yeah.
And I can fully imagine, just the way it is, because we've all grown up seeing people being made fun of everything. Like some kid would go and get like a motte and come to school, and we just like be making fun of that person for the next 1 week.
Yeah.
And we just tend to do all of that. So I think a lot of it just comes, I think maturity will comes from understanding that it's okay for people to do whatever they want to do, as long as you just let them do, and as long as no one's harming themselves or the other person. I guess just go ahead and do it.
Yeah. And more power to you for owning who you are and, just being yourself, honestly. But yeah, I think now we're kind of coming to the end of this conversation. Sadly, I'm having so much fun having this. I don't want it to end, to be honest. But
I know, right?
Yeah.
I'm also just like, wow, this is such nice stuff to think about, and it's so good to be talking to you after so long.
Yeah, I know, right? It's been so much fun, but as they say, all good things must sadly come to an end.
No.
But yes, we always end with these last two questions. So the first one being, what are your aspirations? What are things you're looking forward to, in the near or even distant future?
So my biggest aspiration is to be able to get back to reading the way I used to.
Okay.
Say even before college. I remember like board exams, my parents literally had to find ways to lock up the books because I wouldn't want to study for the exam. I just like have a book and be reading. I've taken books to school and kept under my desk, and textbook on top, like book below it, and all of that. And then you've got the smartphone, and I get so distracted now. I think my biggest aspiration has actually been to just get back to my reading habits, because I realize that everything else, there's the very clear paths to achieve if you want to do something. But just I aspire to be able to read like my 17-year-old self. I've just not been able to do that in a very long time. That's one. But I think in terms of things I want to do, right? I have this list of things that I've always liked to do. I'm not putting any pressure on myself in terms of time about when I want to achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
So one, of course, has been just talking about my skin with children. I think children have played such an important role in just my journey of self-acceptance.
Yeah.
That I do want to write for them about differences.
Okay.
And that's not just limited to physical appearances, but I think just in terms of other conditions, like I would like to talk to them about. Let me put it this way: I would like to see stories in which the protagonists are children, maybe differently abled children or children with different conditions, and not necessarily children. It could even be people with different conditions. And I think that for me is a project I hold very close to me, because I feel like it's a great time to be talking to them about differences, and it's something that we tend to talk a lot more and encourage a lot more these days. So that's one. The other thing that I've always wanted to do is actually discover a lot more of my grandmom's cooking. So she wrote down these recipes for my mom and my aunt when they got married. So there was these like lovely little recipe books, handwritten books that we've got. Okay. And my aunt is the one who cooks pretty much just like my Paati. So just to sort of like standardize those recipes. And there's a beautiful book, actually, a cookbook that I even won a James Beard Award, I think, called 5 Morsels of Love. I don't know if
I've heard of it. I've heard of it, yeah.
By Archana Pidatala. So it's a beautiful book where she's, her grandmother wrote this, how in most Tamil households you see this book called Samaitapar, which is Cook and See, the English version. So the Telugu equivalent of that. Okay. Her grandmother had written that ages ago and had always wanted to publish it in English. Okay. Sadly, she passed before that could happen. So she took it upon herself and said, I'm going to translate my grandmother's book. So it has these, household recipes of, the kind of pachadis and pulusus that they grew up eating. And also something as, I think a coffee custard in that book as well, which is something her grandmom would make for her. And that book is so filled with stories and so rich in just like transporting you to that time, and you realize what an heirloom it actually is. So that's actually what inspired me to even start posting on Instagram and saying, hey, let's talk about like food right now a little bit. And of course, it's taken a lot of pushing from other people, because I'm always like, no, what if I sound so pretentious? What if it's this? What if it's that? That's like the other thing I need to get over. So I think I really want to rediscover my grandmom's cooking and sort of put that knowledge together, even if it just means it's a book that my family is going to, hold on to. And that's also made me realize that for our community, I think the culinary heritage of our community is also maybe not spoken about enough. So
Yeah.
something that might just lead into that eventually. But yeah, I guess it's just like finding these little things to keep doing and just having fun.
No, it's really cool, and I'm really looking forward to all that you do. Because I think especially your writing on food and just the experiences you associate with it is very is very heartwarming to read. Honestly, it's literal soul food. Just throwing that fun.
Thank you.
But
Very clever pun, might I add.
But no, really, it is. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, what you come out with for sure. But yeah, last question. What is a piece of advice or learning that, you'd like to share with people? Can be personal, professional, creative, anything, just something you wish people just were more aware of or knew about.
The thing, I think my biggest learning, which I'm not very great at implementing, but my biggest learning over the past 3 years is that the sexiest thing on the planet is consistency.
A good one, yeah.
It just consistency, and I'm so terrible at it, but whatever it is you do. In fact, I think this was on the Tim Ferriss show. There was a chef called Marco Punora who had come in. He put it in a more simplified way, which he said, repetition is what leads to greatness. So for you to be great at what you do, you just need to keep doing it over and over and over again. And I realized that with my cooking, just in terms of the way I make a particular dish today versus the way I made it a few years ago, there's a marked difference only because I've just done it so many times now.
Yeah.
But I've never consciously looked at it as, oh, I'm doing this to achieve greatness. So maybe for me, it never, but when he said that to me, I think it just like popped. It's so true. I really hope to be able to keep doing more and more of the same thing, so that at least I get to a point where I am finally convinced about my abilities to do it. Not to say that there's like any imposter syndrome at this point, but it's just, self-doubt always creeps in, finds a way to, just come in, just so that you are confident that you've done the best that you can on that particular thing. So I think that's been my biggest learning.
That's a beautiful, saying. And I completely agree. Consistency is really key. I think the more you do something, the better you will get at it. And I think also because we're in a generation where so many people just expect instant gratification, that,
Absolutely.
It's really about putting in the work and taking baby steps, and it's really progress over perfection.
And I think maybe the second thing that I've also realized is that there's really no point in holding yourself to such high standards. I think when you're having fun, just like for me, I've always wanted to be authentic. I don't want to sound pretentious or someone I'm not. But at the same time, I don't want to sound stupid. So I'm always stuck in this place where, I'm like, if it's not perfect, I don't post something. Like my camera roll is filled with pictures of like random things I've made. And I'm always asked, like, why are you not posting this? And I'm like, no, it doesn't look good. Like my recent thing was, no, there's a hair on the floor there. And I was like, no one's going to notice. It's about the food. It's not about the aesthetics about it. And then I'm so like hung up on it being that perfect output that becomes a barrier to my own consistency. So I want to learn to let go of that a little bit and just like loosen up.
Yeah, and we hope you do, because we're all waiting to see all the great content to come out of your page and books and whatever. But really, more power to you. No, really, more power to you, Dhwani. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for doing.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Really, really loved chatting with you, and I really hope you had fun.
Yeah, thank you for thinking of me, and then thank you for having me on this. And I had so much fun because, these are one of the conversations like these with people who get you it's always nicer to like, you end up getting a fresh perspective on yourself sometimes, and you helped me do that. So thank you so much, and good luck with like the podcast and the writing and the editing, and just onwards and upwards from here.
Thank you so much.
So that was my conversation with Janaki Sabesh. I really enjoyed recording this episode, and it was a really wholesome conversation. Closing this episode with a piece written and narrated by Dhwani. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next week with a new guest and a new chronicle to share. Talk soon!
So this is a little note that I wrote when I made pulao once. I've called it an ode to pulao, and you'll see why. An ode to pulao. Growing up, Sundays were my most favorite days because of one thing and one thing only. Sundays were when mummy would make pulao. The rare non-pulao Sundays would see me throw horrendous tantrums and sulk all day. Till date, the last bit of any pulao, be it at home or outside, is always saved for me by mum and dad. Being equal parts enthusiastic and curious about anything food related, when I was old enough, and most importantly, tall enough, to see above the granite countertops, mummy would allow me to be a part of the Sunday ritual. First as a spectator, and then slowly as her little helper. The steps of the ritual always started with mum's prized possession, her red coloured, flat bottomed, non-stick prestige pan, and she'd add the khada masala bit by bit. Some days, if we were lucky, she'd fry cashew nuts and add them to the pulao as well. Mummy would teach me how to wash and soak the rice using as little water as possible, and how each grain of basmati rice should be long and unbroken. My favourite part was when she'd lift the lid off of the pan when the pulao was just done and add a big dollop of ghee on top, knowing fully well that I was following the puddle of melted ghee and would get the first ghee-laden serving. There are only two other households whose pulaus work similar magic for me. Balraj Peripa and Chitra Perima's microwave pulao, which I can eat endlessly with absolutely no shame. And Pushpi Perima and Ramani Peripa's sabzi pulao with Perima's freshly ground garam masala, which I have once eaten for 3 days straight, prompting her to ask me, Mande, are you sure you're not bored? My pulao recipe is a mix of these three: Mummy's masalas, Perima's method of frying the soaked rice and cooking it in the microwave like Peripa. It never fails me. If you've read till the end, here's a high five for you. I recently read a note about why we still buy cookbooks in the age of recipes being online, and the author said something I agree with. Cookbooks were and are always about the stories. As someone whose favourite part of Ottolenghi and Tamimi's Jerusalem is the tale of the Hummus Wars, I couldn't agree more. And after all, I am a storyteller's daughter.